Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today is a very highly requested video that you guys have been asking for a while, and that's actually taken me a long time to make, so we're finally doing it today. We are talking about Halsey's poetry book titled I Would Leave Me If I Could, and you might be quite surprised in my opinion of this. I don't know. I should say, before we jump into talking about the actual book and the content itself, I don't really actually know anything about Halsey. I looked up how to pronounce her name, and I keep wanting to say Halsey, and I think I just did many times. But then I found this other video saying it's pronounced like Halsey, and then I saw her say her name, and she was like Halsey. I don't know how to pronounce her name. I'm sorry. Even listening to her, I can't replicate that sound. It's just, I have a weird accent, alright. Point is, from that 30-second clip I saw of her saying her own name, she seems like a nice person, but other than that, I know nothing about her. I don't really know her music, and I decided to try and be as objective as possible in this review and the book. I didn't want to find out anything about her before I read her stuff, so I decided not to Google her, I decided not to Google the book, because I wanted her poetry to stand on its own, and the book to stand on its own, and for me to give you my just like first impressions and opinions and that kind of thing without being swayed by anything else. So first things first, and a huge positive, and this is going to seem like a minor thing, but I love the cover design of this book. It is absolutely beautiful, it's stunning, it's a book that I am not ashamed to have on my shelf because it looks gorgeous, doesn't it, baby? Little big mouth. I think from what I can tell, apparently she painted this herself, which I adore. I think it's wonderful and beautiful, and I wish more books, especially poetry books, had this kind of art for the cover or inside or anything like this, because I'll take one gorgeous, stunning, unique piece of art like this over 50 generic line drawings any day of the week. I love it, very impressed, excellent first impression. Pardon you. She just had to weigh in there as well. So now to move on to the actual content of the book itself, and I have to say, and this may surprise some of you, I actually really enjoyed the book. Not every poem is perfect, not all are amazingly perfectly good, not all of them are technically sound, but on the whole, a very good collection, especially for a first collection of poetry. I think she spoke about some really important and interesting topics that just on a personal level I really related to and that I've been wanting to see more poetry about. There's a lot of stuff in there that I'm interested in, like her stuff about families and bad relationships and abuse, mental health, figuring out your sexuality, all very important stuff to talk about in poetry, and I think she not only talks about the interesting topics, but she does it well, which is fantastic. There are a lot of bad Instagram poets out there who think they can slap 3 lines together and say it's about mental health and that makes it a good poem, and that's just not the case. These, you can actually tell she's put work and time and effort into, and that I have a hell of a lot of respect for, so I'm impressed on the whole. Some of the poems, I admit, do need more editing. Some felt like middle drafts, so not the first drafts that we've seen in, say, like Gabby Hanna's book or Lily Reinhart's book or anything like that. They seem like middle drafts. They're nearly there, they're nearly finished, but they just need that little bit of extra in places. Not all the poems, though. Those middle drafts were a minority, I have to say. And on the whole, you can tell that she did put time and effort into this. She did, on the whole, curate it quite well. There are a couple of cases where you feel like you're reading the same poem, but we'll talk about one of those in particular in a minute. But on the whole, you can tell a lot of the poems were thoroughly kind of like worked on and had been edited and had been improved upon, and that I think is great. One thing I do wish she'd done is played with different forms of poetry a bit more. So one of my favourite things in reading a collection by someone like, say, Mary Oliver or Wendy Cope or Caroline Duffy is that throughout their books you see them playing with a lot of different formats of poem, a lot of different structures and trying out different things, and they're not just all free verse. And that is what you get in this book. It's kind of all mostly free verse, and I kind of wish she'd mixed it up a bit. I'm sorry, am I not tickling your tummy? I wish she'd mixed it up a bit when it came to the structure and format a little bit more. I wish she'd pushed herself a little bit more. I wish she'd tried some different things from a technical perspective. Basically, I'd have loved to have seen her try and play around with some more traditional structures of poetry, push her technical abilities as a poet a little bit more, and not just show what she can do as a lyricist, if that makes sense. There are some things I'd like to see her improve on and work on, but on the whole, overall, I love her vulnerability and strength in this book. It feels a lot more real and raw than the work of someone like, and I'll say them again, Lily Reinhart or Gabby Hanna, because sometimes they cover the same topics in their poems, but this one by Halsey, it feels, like I say, more real, more raw, more relatable. It just feels more like art. And like I say, even though I don't really know who she is, I found herself relating so much to her work in here, both on kind of like a technical level and as someone who just loves poetry. The ones that I didn't relate to on a personal level, I could still enjoy from a poetic perspective, you know? And I think that kind of speaks volumes, that I can relate to her more despite not knowing who she is than I could with someone like Lily Reinhart, who I am familiar with her other work, you know? I think that speaks a lot about the quality of poetry in this book and how much better it is. So let's talk about some of the specific examples of poetry in this book and talk about what I liked and what I didn't like, what could have been improved on, and what I really enjoyed and want to see more of. So I think one of her main strengths as a poet is how she's able to describe very specific events and scenes in her poems. They're kind of like little vignettes into her life, little small moments that tell us a hell of a lot, and they make them very enjoyable to read. But what she's really good at is telling these stories and showing these moments while leaving the kind of deeper meanings open to a few possible interpretations. So there's not just one reading on a lot of these poems. You can kind of take bits to mean what you want, fit them to your own life, figure maybe this means this means this, or use other bits of knowledge you have or other references or whatever to try and piece together a meaning in these poems. And that's what I think a really good poem does. There's not just one reading to it. So fantastic. For example, she does this really well in two poems, Summer Fruit and Watermelon, which I have a bit of an issue with because they're basically the same poem in two different formats. We'll talk about that little niggle I have in a second, but let's concentrate on the positives for now, specifically looking at Summer Fruit. I spent springs and summers as a child eating the fruit from a watermelon. Grainy sugar bites and juice slick up my cheeks like a Chelsea smile. My mother used to warn me if I swallowed a seed, it would get stuck in my belly and grow a watermelon plant. My stomach would expand till I'd combust. I always spit them out in horror. I spent a spring and a summer eating the fruit from the flesh of your lips, the bounty of two round mounds hard like pink sugar, your grip on my cheeks with a firm hand holding my mouth open, to drop seeds into my belly, to spit a virus in my throat that grew into a giant yew plant, the branches crawling up the walls of my insides and begging to claw my mouth open and make me say things I don't mean. The dying leaves flaking off and swaying to the pit of my stomach in an imaginary breeze, landing with a deafening thump, echoes that bounce up between my teeth and remind my tongue there is no more watermelon, just empty space. So at first glance here, we have a poem about innocence and experience, about growing up, maturing, kind of sexual discovery, that kind of stage of your life where you ignore all the warnings you were given as a child and you follow through with these bad things, and then you have to face the consequences. Clearly, the narrator of this poem starts off as this innocent young child eating watermelon in the summer, you know, completely carefree and oblivious to any possible danger she might face because of her actions, which is, you know, clearly alluded to in the how the juice slicks up my cheeks like a Chelsea smile lines. And she's warned of the possible dangers by her mother, and she starts to get scared and change her behaviour, until the temptation becomes too much. However, once she's given in, she has to face the consequences, and in this case we're told it's a literal plant growing inside of her, changing who she is until she ends up ultimately alone and kind of empty. But of course, because this is a poem, this is all metaphorical. So the watermelon seeds are never the actual danger. Instead, I'd suggest that it's more of a metaphor for sexual expression, given into sexual desires, and just kind of sexuality in general. Look at the references to fruit, like grainy sugar bites and juice slicking up her cheeks. You know, she talks of round mounds, hard like pink sugar, eating the fruit from the flesh of your lips. It's all quite raw, quite graphic, but in some ways quite sort of sensual. And it reminds me a lot of how Christina Rossetti writes about fruits and food in general in her absolutely beautiful genius poem, which I've spoken about on this channel before, Goblin Market, in which we see these goblins using fruit to seduce young women into running away with them, basically then having their way with them and thrusting them back into the world, all ruined in a mess and falling apart. So in Rossetti's poem, the goblins call out to the young women, "Taste them and try, currants and gooseberries, bright like fire barberries, figs to fill your mouth, citrons from the south, sweet to the tongue and sound to eye, come by, come by." And it's absolutely beautiful, stunning use of language. It's amazing. I love this poem. If you haven't read Goblin Market, I thoroughly recommend it. It's a fairly long read, but it tells this incredible story. It's wonderful. Everything about it is perfect. And while Halsey doesn't quite play with language and rhyme and rhythm in the same way that Rossetti does, I kind of think that there may be some intentional allusion in Halsey's poem to the works of people like Rossetti. You know, it feels intentional. Fruits have definitely been used throughout literature and mythology and all these stories from our past to represent temptation and specifically the downfall of women. So not just in Rossetti's poem, but all the way back to the Bible. In Genesis, Eve is tempted by fruit from the tree of knowledge. In Greek mythology, Hades tricks or tempts, however you want to word it, Persephone into staying in the underworld by feeding her pomegranate seeds. More recently, we've seen poets and artists kind of twist this tradition of fruit being the downfall of women, and you have absolute legends like Grace Nichols who kind of turn this trope on its head, and we often see her using imagery of fruits and foods, but mostly the fruits, in her poetry in a super empowering way that says, I'm being tempted, but more I am the temptation. It's fascinating. So with Grace Nichols, you have poems like Even Though, in which she writes, "Man I love but won't let you devour, even though I'm all watermelon and star apple and plum when you touch me." Or in Invitation 2, she gets a little more graphic still and teasingly warns that my breasts are huge, exciting amnions of watermelon your hands can't cup. It's fantastic. Grace Nichols is a genius. She's one of my favourite poets. And Halsey uses the same kind of straightforward but strong imagery that Nichols does, but for the more traditional message, so kind of going down the path of Rossetti's storytelling with Nichols' use of language. It's interesting. So to tell the story of a woman tempted by the fruits of others and it being her downfall, definitely a reference to how women were always kind of expected to express their sexuality throughout history and not give in to sexual desires. You know, sex was seen as this tempting fruit, but we had to avoid it at all costs, otherwise we would be ruined. A woman being sexually confident or very sex positive or just owning her own sexuality was always kind of seen as a bit of a threat and definitely frowned upon, and that's why you have women who were a little more sexually open accused of witchcraft or this or this or that, or shamed or put in prison or killed or any other things throughout history. The treatment of women has been horrific, and Halsey's just telling another version of that story here. I'd argue that she's making this reference even more apparent as she chooses to talk about how it's not so much eating the fruit that's bad, but specifically the seed of the fruit. And so from what I've gathered throughout this book, Halsey is bisexual, so I think this is kind of a reference to kind of pointing the fault more at men than women in this particular poem, because of the whole seed being like semen type thing. I think it might possibly be more of a reference to how it's more dangerous to be sexually involved with a man than a woman, perhaps, or maybe that's just one reading, or maybe that's just what I'm taking away from this. But you know, another reading could be that it's a reference to risk of pregnancy when you have sex with a man, especially as she goes on to describe swallowing the seed as causing, "My stomach would expand till I'd combust." If that's not potentially a pregnancy reference, then I don't know what it is. Ultimately though, whether she is referring specifically to pregnancy or just a sexual relationship, it doesn't end well in the poem, and whatever grew inside her leaves, dying leaves flaking off and swaying to the pit of my stomach in an imaginary breeze, landing with a deafening thump. And eventually she ends up changed as a person, kind of feeling alone and unable to enjoy her fruit anymore. And again, the imagery here reminds me of it kind of being a more contemporary take on how after eating the goblin's fruits, one of Rossetti's characters, it says, "Her hair grew thin and grey, she dwindled as the fair full moon doth turn to swift decay and burn her fire away." So, simple poem here by Halsey, like on the surface, but a hell of a lot in it. And I like this because it makes it very accessible, I find. I think there's a lot more in here that we could potentially talk about, and I want to, but I want to quickly move on to the other poem in the book that uses the same kind of images to tell an almost identical story. But this one does feel a little more traditional in the structure. It relies on a few more rhymes and half rhymes. It has a stronger rhythm. It has a more, I guess, like formal structure to it, if that makes sense. You know, these 4-line stanzas repeated, that kind of thing. I think the meaning in this one, this poem called Watermelon, I think it's a bit more obvious, but I'm not sure if it's too obvious. I can't decide which of the two poems I like more, but let me know down in the comments what you think. So I kind of don't think the book needs both poems. I think one would do, since they're basically the same. And maybe she should have done or found some way of combining the two, but let me read you Watermelon and we'll talk about this in a second. He loves to bring me watermelon. Spits in my mouth seeds to grow inside my stomach like a thing that begs to feed. I lick his lips from watermelon spread across my cheeks, and that pink sugar Chelsea smile is hiding underneath. Now I devour watermelon, bouncing on his knee. I rock my body back and forth so he can feel the heat. I'm dripping like a watermelon, soaking through my seat. I bite my lip and suckle on the words between my teeth. And oh, the taste of watermelon. Subtle, but it's sweet. I kneel down on the wooden floor and beg him to proceed. He fills my mouth with watermelon. No one hears me scream. To overdose on sugar is more painful than it seems. My tummy hurts from watermelon. He can be so mean, but smiles like a gentleman and licks my body clean. And when there is no watermelon, only vicious weeds, he puts his fingers in my mouth to taste the way I bleed. Now all I crave is watermelon every time I leave. You know, at first when I read these, I thought I preferred summer fruit, but the more I read them, I'm really edging towards watermelon. I do think the second one might be my favourite of the two. I think in a lot of ways I prefer the more graphic imagery in this, and I'd have liked to have seen a little bit more of that in Summer Fruits. And I also think it's brilliant how uncomfortable it is when she juxtaposes these seemingly innocent or childlike images or lines or language with overtly sexual references. It's uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, and that's the point. So for example, now I devour watermelon, bouncing on his knee. I rock my body back and forth so he can feel the heat. You know, the opening bit, you have this image of someone, you know, bouncing on someone's knee, like a parent might bounce a child on their knee completely innocently and lovely, sweet, whatever. However, the last two lines of the stanza completely change that meaning and imply that it's more like, you know, she's getting off on rubbing herself against him. Same with a little bit later on when you get this incredibly childish way of saying, my tummy hurts from watermelon, he can be so mean. Sounds almost like a petulant child being like, Mum, my tummy hurts. But then that's followed by a description of a man in a very sexual way, clearly licking her body. And it's incredibly uncomfortable to read, but that's clearly exactly what she was going for, because it's about men sexualizing even very young women. It's about a woman discovering her sexuality and transitioning from child to woman, and how uncomfortable that can often be, and how often men will sexualize us way too young when we're naive and inexperienced and not fully in control. And a lot of this actually reminded me of some of the images in Caroline Duffy's Little Red Cap poem, which again, another one we've spoken about on this channel before, but that's also, oh careful baby, that's also a poem about a woman discovering her sexuality with an older man. And so again, you get these uncomfortable images of juxtaposing kind of quite childlike things with very sexual things. So in Caroline Duffy's poem, you get lines like, I clung till dawn to his thrashing fur, for what little girl doesn't dearly love a wolf? I find Halsey's version is very kind of reminiscent of that sort of imagery, and while it's uncomfortable, while it's unpleasant, this is definitely something I'm very interested in and want to read more about, because it's something that I think a lot of women go through and experience, this kind of transition from childhood to being a woman, this journey of sexual discovery and kind of expressing your sexuality, and how often a lot of men will take advantage of that and sort of use us, and how that's not okay, but it's something a lot of women have to go through. It's something that's interesting to me and that I do want to read more about, so I definitely commend her for doing it very well here. So in that respect, I think Watermelon as a poem is perhaps a little more powerful than Summer Fruits, because it focuses a lot more on, you know, those elements of innocence experience and so on. However, where I think Summer Fruits has the advantage is that it contains more elements of like her mother actually warning her about this, even if they fall on deaf ears. And that's where I think it kind of ties in and is a bit of an allusion to old fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood, hence the link I made to Duffy's Little Red Cap, you know. So I don't know. I don't know which one I prefer. There are elements of both that I like. There are a lot of repeated elements, for example, the references to a Chelsea smile and stuff like that, and spitting seeds in her mouth, that's an image that's in both. I kind of wish you could have combined these both into one solid poem, because there's so much good stuff in both of these. I just don't think you need them both in one book, and that's where a better editor would have stepped in and been like, no, hang on, let's nail this down. Okay, this is actually a perfect moment for a quick little interspersed thing. Not sponsorship or anything, but it is a little bit of shameless promotion of one of my friends. I'm filming this after I filmed the rest of the video because I forgot to do it earlier, so sorry if this seems kind of out of the blue and weird, but I wanted to put it in. But if you enjoy books like me and you like your literature stuff, and if you also happen to be a fan of scented candles, but one of my friends that I went to uni with, Annmarie, she is a wonderful person, absolutely lovely. She is an author, she writes short stories and novels and poetry in her own right. She's fantastically talented, and she has started a small business called Chilights, in which she does handmade soy candles that are all kind of book and literature themed, and they are the best things ever. She's not paying me for this. She didn't ask me to do this. I bought some of her candles and I'm so impressed. I just wanted to give her a little bit of a shout out. And she has very sweetly offered a 10% discount code to all of you guys watching this now. So if you want to go and get any of your own candles, you can do. It's not affiliate or anything. I don't get anything out of this. I'm not being paid for this. I just genuinely want to support a friend and small business owner who is absolutely killing it with her products, and help where I can, really, because I believe in her products so much and I think she's fantastic. So I actually treat myself to 3 candles that I have not stopped burning since I got them, and they are wonderful. My favourite one is Cinnamon Forest, which she describes as frosted pines and cinnamon spice reflected on the starlit ice, and this is the most amazing smelling candle ever. It reminds me of cinnamon whiskey and cinnamon sweets and mulled cider and Christmas, and it smells like a home should smell to me. I love it. This is my favourite one. But the other ones I got are a little more obviously literature inspired, and you have Regency Romance, which smells of peonies, violets and carnations, and if you saw my Bridgerton video and you're a fan of that kind of genre, this is the candle for you. It really does smell like it belongs in a period novel. It's beautiful. And if you're a little bit of a nerd like me, oh, I love this one. This one I've not stopped burning either. The other one I got is Liquid Courage, which smells of butterbeer rich with toffee and vanilla, sipped in front of a roaring hearth as a winter wind howls outside. And yes, this one is inspired by butterbeer from Harry Potter, so oh my god, it smells incredible. It smells good enough to eat. This is one I like to burn, because I'm really stupid. You know, on like a really cold night when you cuddle up with a really good book and you just kind of want to, I don't know, eat some cookies and just like have a hot chocolate and just like snuggle up warm and have Kyra on your knee and read a book. This is the one that I burn then. There you go. So anyway, I'll put a discount code on screen now and down in the comments below. So if you want, you can go and get 10% off your order. Like I say, I'm not getting anything for this. I just wanted to support a friend and wonderful person and small business, and yeah, I love these so much, so I want to give them a little bit of a shout out. So thank you for letting me do that. Let's jump back to the book. Moving on though, another really strong part of Halsey's why can't I say her name? Another strong part of her poetry is this real sense of rhythm that she has. And I shouldn't be surprised by this because she's a musician, but I still was, because I've read poetry by musicians before, Gabby Hanna, that had no rhythm whatsoever. So I guess because of that, my hopes weren't that high, but she did a great job. I think there's a few really fantastic examples of this. I think one of the earliest ones is the book is a poem called Memorize, and I'm hoping I can actually read this well enough to kind of get across to you the actual rhythm in this poem. I'm hoping I can read this well enough, is what I'm trying to say. I'm a boyish mess, a boasting contest with an inferiority complex. I can't make friends. I've got an eager desperation to be up on what's next. I have too much sex. I say it's because I'm anxious and I'm overly stressed. I can't take blame. I funnel through liquor and spit out my pain. I'm no good with fame. There's a love-hate relationship with noise in my brain, except for when you speak my name, because you take it in vain, take it in vain. I could fall asleep here, crawl inside the sleeping bags under your eyes, but I stay awake to memorize. So you have such a strong rhythm, fairly fast-paced, very punchy in places, and her use of rhymes is really, really cleverly done and cleverly placed. Little bits of like consonants or assonance in places really drives home the importance of certain parts of her message, makes certain bits stands out, shows you what's important and what message she's actually trying to get across. So for example, those opening lines, she really puts the emphasis on certain words. So she has boyish mess, boasting contest, inferiority complex. You really have that little punch at the end of not necessarily at the end of the lines, but at the end of these important words. So she's making sure she emphasizes the right bits to pack a punch, to grab your attention, to suck you in. And it's interesting because, especially in these opening lines here, the words she's choosing to focus on are fairly contradictory. They kind of switch back and forth between insecurity and overconfidence, which really like drives home the entire message of the poem, telling us that she's this person who's unsure about who she is, but she's also hyper aware of her faults that she needs to work on. And yeah, the way she switches seamlessly between them is fantastic, and it actually makes it a really relatable poem. Those insecurities are portrayed in a really quite realistic way. It's good. What do you think? Yeah, you want to snort into the microphone some more? Very clingy today, aren't you, baby? I know. Some of the rhymes do kind of fall a little into cliche territory for me, and they're a little, could have been better. For example, the last lines in which she literally rhymes under your eyes with stay awake and memorize. Not my favourite part. I think there's better bits. Just actually overall in this poem, I wish she'd stopped at the part about there's a love-hate relationship with noise in my brain, which, love that line, totally relate to it, very insightful, love it. Up to this point, the poem is a very kind of real, relatable insight into her life, her ways of thinking, the things she struggles with, what she's working through, and I like that. I wanted to read more of that, and I want to hear more about that. I don't so much care about this second character that she brings in, where she wants to, crawl into the bags under his eyes and memorize. I don't care about that character so much. I wish she'd focused more on her bits and her way of thinking and all that kind of thing, and figuring things out for herself, but that might just be a personal preference on my part. I'm sure some people like it. It's all good. A similar poem to this is another one of hers called Bad Day 1, which talks a lot about similar issues to this poem with, the insecurities and the problems and the faults and all this kind of stuff and overthinking. But I find this poem, this Bad Day 1, has stronger imagery, but a slightly weaker rhythm. But overall, I kind of prefer this poem because I prefer the story it tells as a whole and how it ends. I'm sorry, I'm having another bad day. My bones are creaking and my eyes leak like a broken faucet. My mind is a bullet train and I can't stop it. I'm stuck in the middle of an avalanche and I'm not moving. These things, they come and go. And I mean half of everything I tell you. I'm half of everything I hate. And half of anything I create is you too. So I start to hate the music when I hate you. But to go back slightly to the subject of rhyme and rhythm, if you're into that strong rhythmic style in her poems and that quite punchy this and this and this, and it's got quite a strong rhythm and a focus on this and this, and if you like that kind of thing, getting a little carried away there. If you like that kind of thing, I also recommend her poems Tongue Twister and American Woman that are in this collection. They also work for having very good rhythm and rhyme, and yeah, I recommend them. Give them a read. To move on again, one of her poems that really hit me hard on a quite personal level was the poem Virus. And as you may know from all my poetry videos, if you've seen them before, I am really not a fan of poetry that throws in a twist ending in the last line or two. Poems that have a punchline. It's a cliche, I normally hate it. Please don't do it, just give me a solid bit of work, don't rely on shock value. However, this poem does that, and it does it well. It works. I actually got a little emotional. This is a little twist that I didn't see coming. This is a little twist that works, and no matter how many times I read it, it still works. So this is Virus. I once had a fever so high, I was left to my bed for 7 days. There was a man standing on my mattress with a shovel, lifting chunks out of it angrily. He wiped his brow and his sweat collected in the divots of my blanket and made a little pond. A scum pond, with talking frogs and lily pads. The pond grew deeper as the man dug harder and sweated. I was drowning. A goldfish swam up my throat and flopped around in my mouth. I clenched my jaw and tossed and turned in the scum pond. White and grey algae blinding me and filling my nose with fuzzy mould. I tried to scream and retrieve the fish from the back of my mouth. I was choking. I tried to kick, but the man was standing on my legs. His weight was too much to bear, and I feared that shovel would dismount onto my head and split my skull if I provoked him any more. I tried to yank the fish out again, but it struggled. I attached its jaws to the opening of my throat and it would not budge. I yanked and I screamed, and my mother came rushing into the room, tripping over her feet. I was trying to rip out my tongue. She fixed my blankets. She stroked my hair that stuck to me like cotton candy dissolving in water. I wanted to cry, but feared I'd fill the pond again. When my fever broke, I realised the man and the fish were all a dream. And so was she. And there's just something about this poem. The imagery in that first section is so strong and vivid, and you honestly feel a little panicked, almost like you're experiencing it too, and you're struggling to breathe there with her, and you're scared yourself. And the use of punctuation is excellent. Simple words, end-stopped lines quite often, and very little punctuation in general in terms of not many like commas or pauses or that kind of thing, but frequent use of conjunctions, yeah. I'm forgetting all my grammar words. Basically, she says and a lot, that's what I'm trying to say. A long time since I've actually studied grammar, I'm forgetting all the words. Anyway, yeah, she says the word and a lot to connect these things, and she intersperses all of these kind of long run-on and with these short, sharp declaratives like I was drowning, I was choking. And overall, the mix of it all combined really creates a sense of anxiety and panic, and it's brilliantly done. And then suddenly it all ends because she's safe and it's all good and everything slows down and it calms, and her mum arrives and she's in a bit of a panic, she's going to save her and she trips up, and then just simply she fixed my blankets. And it's as simple as that. And that line, isolated from the rest, suddenly everything in the poem is grounded in reality again, and it's all safe and it's over and things are better, except they're not, because the poem continues. And she stroked my hair that stuck to me like cotton candy dissolving in water. I wanted to cry, but feared I'd fill the pond again. So clearly she's still experiencing a lot of anxiety and worry. That's not gone away. And this image of the hair stuck to her like cotton candy dissolving in water. That's uncomfortable. That's sticky and gross, and it feels a bit dirty, a bit unpleasant. I don't like it. I hate sticky things. And it doesn't fit with the tone of the poem, because you're like, but the mum came in. She's supposed to make it all better. She fixed the blankets. Why is this still... I know, baby, it's okay. Why is this still uncomfortable? Why is this not okay? Aren't mothers supposed to fix this stuff? They're not meant to make you feel dirty and gross and sticky. And it kind of throws you for a second. And while you're still there, kind of disoriented and confused and uncomfortable, she hits you with that line telling you that she does get better all by herself, because she realizes not only were the man and fish just a dream, but so was the mother looking after her. It's a poem about parents not being there. And it's a poem about how even when you're used to them not being there, even when you don't necessarily expect them to be there, even when you're used to dealing with things alone, it's still always a shock every time you realize that you actually are on your own. And you never really stop needing your mum, no matter how old you get. And you never really stop needing a mum in the difficult times. And that's especially true when you don't actually have one that's there for you. And that's what I think she really, really captures well in this poem. How sometimes a girl just needs her mum and she doesn't have one there for her. And how it's okay, because as shocking as it is and as difficult as it is, as emotional as it is, we see that she does feel better by the end of the poem. She's okay, her fever breaks, she's fine. And even though she wants a mum, even though it would have been nice to have a mum there for her, she still got through it by herself. She still, even though it feels like she needs her, she doesn't. And that's okay. And that's a nice message to be taken away, I think. That's something I think some of us need to hear sometimes. I liked this. I need more poems like this. I felt very understood when I read this and a little less alone, and I appreciate that. And also, I want to remind you that I'm always going to be here for you. I'm always going to help you untangle your blankets, okay? No sticky foreheads. I'll always be your mum. Always. She has some other really brilliant poems as well about her childhood and difficult things she dealt with during that time. One of them in particular is The Painter, which is excellent. It's a story about being sexually abused as a child, and it's emotional. It's very difficult to read, but it's an important one. It's nothing particularly special in terms of poetic technique or anything like that. It's more the content, which is brilliant, and I have a lot of respect for her telling that story in that way. It works very well. Another poem is Everything, which is an incredibly relatable poem about growing up poor. I like that one a lot as well. I related to that one a lot. Lighthouse was another one of her poems that hit a little too close to home for me. This kind of got me on a personal level as well. Lighthouse is the story of a clearly toxic relationship with an abusive man, and at first, she talks about the relationship starting off well and she enjoys being alone with him, but by the end she's literally begging for anything, like even a natural disaster to happen so that someone just comes and saves her and gets her out of there and she doesn't have to be alone with him anymore. And it reminded me a lot of how things were with Johnny at the end. Well, it reminded me of how things were with Johnny the entire time. Like when I first met him, he was living with his parents, and I remember like both of us were always saying how nice it would be for him to get his own place so we could have more like privacy and time alone and just be adults and not live with his parents. Or we'd spend a lot of time here at my house because, I live alone, I've got my own place. But as time kind of went on and the relationship went on and he got more and more abusive and nasty and all these issues came to light, I'd kind of start to be kind of scared of having him here in my flat because it meant we'd be alone, or I'd be scared of going to his house when he got his own place because it meant his parents weren't there to step in when he got too aggressive or to kind of save me when things were rough. Like there were literally times when I had to sleep in the same room as his parents, or his mum would put me in a different bedroom to sleep in because Johnny was just out of control basically. And that's all of that's what this poem reminds me of. And Carrie, baby, I love you, but you're snorting right into the microphone. Do you want to come to this side, please? Anyway, sorry, back to the poem itself. There's literally a few lines in here where I feel like she could literally be writing about Johnny, and that's why I think the kind of like relatableness works so well, because normally I'm not a fan of a poem that only works because it's relatable, but in this case, it's relatable because it works, if that makes sense. So anyway, let me read you the poem and then we'll talk about specifics. Okay, what I will say though is there's a word in this poem that I can never pronounce, and it's Rorschach. You know the paint blob tests. Never know how to pronounce it. Is it like Rorschach? I don't know how to pronounce it. Saying words is hard. This is why I stick to reading. Why did I become a YouTuber? He was almost 7 feet tall with black oily hair that stuck to his forehead in patches, like a Rorschach test when he'd sweat. His bedroom was a dark, cavernous prison at the bottom level of the house, separate from the rest. This granted him at first privacy, and at the end, protection. I used to love being far away from everyone else in the house because it meant I could keep him to myself longer, keep him from being distracted. But by the final days, I cursed the distance and would silently pray that the earth would cave beneath us and the bedroom addition would grow closer to the main house in a tangle of excavated tree roots and tectonic plates. I silently prayed for an earthquake so our guests could hear him scream. He would stuff his nose with cocaine for days on end until the rims of his nostrils were caked with white like cement, and bleeding sores leaked yellow-orange pus from him reopening the wounds he had burnt into his airways. He would pace the room in circles, with his t-shirt sticking to him in a cold sweat, and cry. A cry full of pain and loathing that twisted face like pottery on an unmanned wheel. He would punch himself in the head, banging his fist against his forehead and temple until his fingers, full of rings, left pictures on his skin, his knuckles burst open. He would put his bleeding hand around my neck and press me against the wall. His eyes would flicker back to life like a film projector malfunctioning in a pitch-black cinema before the title card ran. He would stare at the space between my eyebrows, too cowardly to make eye contact, and say, "I'm going to fucking kill you." And I would believe him. So I would take his hand off of my neck gently and wrap my arms around his head like I was cradling a newborn and stroke his hair and whisper that it would be okay. And again he would cry that siren's cry like a warning to all ships at sea. We'd resign into a damp bed and his knuckles would stick to the sheets as the blood dried and clotted and scabbed, and I would lie awake as he slept, snoring through his coagulated nostrils. I would stare at the ceiling, too afraid to let a single tear escape, lest the subtle movement be enough to wake him from his docile state. When he was sleeping, he looked beautiful, like an old Hollywood star, and with his eyes shut and the siren scream no longer sounding off from his slack mouth in the master bedroom detached from the house, I became a lighthouse. Dim glow beaming from my eyes, a man in my arms, kerosene running low in the tower, praying the gods would unleash their fury and send waves so strong they'd crash through the hills of California and the ground would collapse and bury us both in the rubble. And I think this poem contains some of the best, most graphic, and yet absolutely disturbing descriptions in the entire book. For example, he would stuff his nose with cocaine for days on end until the rims of his nostrils were caked with white like cement, and bleeding sores leaking yellow-orange pus from reopening the wounds he had burnt in his airways. Even the next bit, actually, he would pace the room in circles with his cold t-shirt sticking to him in a cold sweat and cry. It's disgusting, and it's meant to be, and that's why it's so damn powerful. The use of colours in that description, for example, fantastic. You have caked with white, leaking yellow-orange pus, very vivid, not very nice to think about, and that's because they're describing not very nice things. It works. And plus, I want you to pay attention to the little things in this poem as well. For example, the line about the wounds he had burnt into his airways. Notice the use of the pronoun there. It's not the cocaine had burnt, he had burnt. He's done this. She's showing the blame is on him. This is his problem. He chose to do the drugs. He chose to overuse the drugs. He's the one who won't get any help. He's the one who did this to himself. No one else. And it's a subtle thing, but it's the things like that that I appreciate, that work really well in this poem, that show she has thought about every single word, and that's very, very important, isn't it, Bean? Just pop you down there. I think this bit hits me kind of hard as well because Johnny also had like a massive cocaine problem, and he was taking way more than he ever really told me about, and he'd lie about if he'd been using or how much he'd been using, and sometimes like he'd tell me he'd done none at all, but he'd come back from the loo with literal like powder on his nose, and then, you know, it would always slowly unravel from there. It would be like, oh, I only did one line or two or a bag or two bags. It was just ridiculous, and he hadn't got to this point yet where, you know, he had like wounds or anything, thankfully, but this poem still reminded me of him because while he wasn't causing himself the physical damage yet, he was messing with his head, he was refusing to get any help, and the cocaine would make him way more aggressive than usual, especially towards me, and it was terrifying. But what is quite empowering about this poem is that it reminds me, no matter how scary Johnny was in those moments when he was being aggressive and he was messing himself up and he was hurting me in the process, no matter how scary he seemed, and he was terrifying and I still have nightmares about him, he was just a pathetic little boy under all of that. And you have lines in this poem like, with his t-shirt sticking to him in a cold sweat, you know, pacing the room and crying, like, that's a scared, pathetic child with nothing else. And that's exactly what Johnny was, and it's important to be reminded of that sometimes, and to not let him get worked up in my head as a big bad monster. And so that's why I like this poem and parts of it like this. There are so many like horribly relatable little moments in this too, like, you know, I would stare at the ceiling too afraid to let a single tear escape, lest a subtle movement be enough to wake him. Stuff like that, been there. When she describes him sleeping as with his eyes shut and the siren scream no longer sounding off, like that that sort of reference is brilliant. I'm sure you probably know this already, but like in mythology, sirens were these stunning but terrifying half-bird, half-women creatures who would sing the most beautiful songs to sailors and seduce them and distract them so their ships would sail into rocks and they would die. And, you know, there's no reason for why the sirens did this. They didn't necessarily have an ultimate goal. It's just, it was their nature. It was who they are, who they were. And that's kind of typical of a narcissistic abuser, isn't it? Just as Johnny was, and just as the man in this poem seems to be, you know, so charismatic and charming and appealing on the outside and beautiful, you know, and they draw you in and they charm you and they seduce you, and then they ultimately just destroy you because that's what they do. It's in their nature. That's what a narcissistic abuser does. And it's sad that she realizes that the only time she can try and get help, try and get away, the only time it stops is when he physically can't manipulate her because he's asleep, you know? Incredibly relatable. I'm way more emotional talking about this than I thought I would be, I'm sorry. This isn't her only poem about abuse in the book. You know, she touched on some stuff about bad relationships earlier in the watermelon poems, but there's other ones as well. For example, her poem, Tertiary, another word I struggle to say, has this one particular stanza that really stands out to me that reads, "Chartreuse like an aging bruise, he speaks soft words, but it's still abuse. I forget when you sweet seduce, we're in love, but it's no excuse," which is a part that hit me hard. Again, and going back to one of her biggest strengths is really her like horrible, disturbing, vivid descriptions. They're fantastic because, you know, another example is when she describes this cake in the poem called The Baker. It says, "The inside was cherry red. Globular, bulbous chunks leaked from the center like giant blood clots bathing in buttercream. I imagined I had taken my still beating heart from my chest and baked it into the middle." She's fantastic in these descriptions. They're so effective. They work so well. There's also a few poems in this book that really make excellent use of an Anaphora. I realised the last time I spoke about this in a video, I have no idea how to pronounce this. And some people were like, "Oh, have I been pronouncing it wrong all this time?" Then other people were like, "You're pronouncing it wrong?" And I'm like, well, it probably could be. Because this is what happens when you only really learn by reading and writing and you don't actually say things out loud. Me. You have no idea how to pronounce any word and you sound like an idiot sometimes. I do this a lot in my videos. I don't always know how to pronounce words, and also I have a bit of a weird accent, and I have a little, I don't know how clear it is, but I struggled with speaking a bit growing up because I didn't have any front teeth. So even now I have a slight, ever so slight lisp. I'm like stumbling over that there. I have an ever so slight lisp when I try and speak. So some words I can't say. And this isn't the point. The point is, I have a terrible voice for reading poetry, and I'll still try and do it anyway. And I have no idea if you pronounce it Anaphora or Anaphora, but the repetition thingy, right? Anyway, sorry, back to the point. As I've said before, an Anaphora or Anaphora, I don't know. It's this really powerful technique, right, which can be very easily overused or done poorly or done lazily. But when it's done well, it is absolutely killer in poetry and lyrics and just any kind of persuasive writing, really. We've looked at other descriptions. We've looked at other examples in my videos before. For example, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech uses it very well. We spoke about Nina Simone's Ain't Got No, I Got Life lyrics. Uses it excellently. I think in another video we've spoken about Maya Angelou using it in her incredible poem, Phenomenal Woman. And in a few of her other poems as well, actually. But basically, an anaphora or anaphora involves repeating words or a phrase throughout a poem or lyrics or sentences in a very kind of specific way. So Halsey uses it really well in two particular poems. One is Ordinary Boys, which I really recommend you go and read. It's a great one. And another one is called Fun Girl. Both incredibly important and powerful poems, and I think Fun Girl is probably one of my favourite poems in the book. Again, it kind of resonates with me on a personal level. So throughout the poem, she uses this anaphora to kind of like repeat a line, which is something along the line of, "I'm the blank girl." And she does this throughout the poem, like every line of the poem, basically, to describe all the different stereotypes and, you know, types of girl she's supposed to be, all these types of girl she's like trying to fulfill or she's expected to be, you know, at any given time. And each line having roughly the same structure to me says that, you know, she realizes that men and society want to place her in these narrow little boxes at any particular moment. And she's only meant to be this one type of girl and not the others at any moment. And it kind of reduces her down to these basic ideas. People don't see her as the big, whole, complex woman that she is. She has to fit in these narrow little stereotypes, these narrow little boxes. She has to be this one type of girl here, this one type of girl here. And, you know, people don't want to deal with this part of her or this part of her because they're too complicated. They make her too real. They make her too human. So they'd rather she's just the cool girl here. They'd rather she's just the fun girl here. They don't want to think about her as a whole, complete woman. And sometimes this means that she gets used or treated with less respect, or she's looked down on, or she's compared to these other two-dimensional ideas of girls. The poem has a very important message in this respect. It's interesting, it's important, but also she's really played with form and structure here to get her message across, to drive it home, and I think that's great. This is what is missing in a lot of the work of kind of like Instagram poets and celebrity poets and stuff like that, is that they don't often use the form to get the message across as well as the actual words. Does that make sense? So a good poem has a message it's trying to get across, and it uses both language and form and structure to do that. And this is exactly what she's doing here, and she's doing it well. So I'm going to read you the poem, and then you can let me know your thoughts. I am the fun girl. I am the spit hanging down from your tongue girl, and the choke me hard as you can girl, and the give it all up for a man girl, and the plaid skirt and white knee-high socks girl, and the pistol that's loaded and cocked girl. They don't mind when you call me a slut girl, and the smack her real hard on the butt girl. I'm a swallow my feelings and lie girl. I'm a lie there and let him inside girl. 'Cause I don't want to make him mad girl. I'm better off being the bad girl. 'Cause then nothing hurts when they leave girl, except his grip on your sleeve girl. You say yes to the threesomes and drinks girl, 'cause you really still care what he thinks girl. You're not boring or mean like his old girl. She was crazy, or that's what you're told girl. So you'll get further if you are the fun girl. But you'll never be the only one girl. You'll get older and wish you'd known girl, 'cause you gave him way too much of your soul girl. Now you don't expect men to be kind girl. You just use them and leave them behind girl. It's so hard to grow up as the fun girl. You'll be trapped in your days as a young girl. A memory for men you loved girl. Oh, that fun girl. It's a, fantastic, amazing poem that's just scarily relatable, you know. And notice how the repetition changes throughout the poem. So it begins with her repeating girl only as the label that she's been given. For example, I am the fun girl. I'm the spit hanging down from your tongue girl. These are labels that men have put on her and roles she's been expected to fulfill for a man. But it ends with her using the label girl to address other women. You know, now you don't expect them to be kind girl, you know. You'll get older and wish that you'd known girl, you know, that kind of thing. And so it changes the poem from being this is the crap that they did to me, to a warning to younger women. I kind of don't let them do it to you. It makes it all the more powerful and important, and something that I think every young woman needs to read and hear and remember. You know, it's saying, they made me this kind of girl. Now, you, young, experienced, naive woman, please don't let them do it to you. And that's kind of what this poem's saying and what it's going through. And I think it's fantastic and important, and something a lot of young women need to read and hear and understand. And I think on this note, I'd love to kind of like pass this book and these poems onto you and hear what you guys thought of it and what you liked about it, what you didn't like, what you'd like to see changed and improved, and also just what you enjoyed and what you'd like to see more of. I feel like I've only kind of scratched the surface with this video and this kind of analysis, but there's so much more to potentially talk about. But this video's already way too long and I've spoken for way too long. But in conclusion, I like this book a lot, and I'm very surprised because I went in thinking this might just be another celebrity poetry book, but I actually think she has a lot of skill and talent and put a lot of work into this, and I'm very impressed. Is it a perfect collection? No. Is it expert pro-level, flawless technical poetry? No. But for a first collection, it's incredible and it has a lot of heart. I think there's a lot of potential here, and there's a hell of a lot of important stuff to say in this, and I do thoroughly recommend it. I've always said in the past that even with books I don't like Milk and Honey or Swimming Lessons, at least I can see how they're useful for getting people interested in poetry. And you know, that's a good thing, but I don't necessarily think they're the best tools to do that with because they're not very good in terms of their content. However, this book I think is perfect for that. This is exactly the kind of collection that I think is a great way of getting people who are usually intimidated by poetry into poetry, because it's very accessible, but it's still good. It's written by a celebrity, so they can kind of maybe relate in that sense, but it's still good. And this for me is what kind of celebrity books should be. It's not just a book that's only readable because it's by someone you know. It's a good book that just happens to be written by a celebrity. That's what I think we need more of. That's what I like to see. This is what I enjoy. So overall, great job. Would recommend. Thanks to everyone who asked me to review this, because I'm very glad that I did. I think some people might be a little put off by it because it's maybe too vulgar in places. There are a lot of kind of like sexual references and stuff, but I don't think it's sexual for the sake of being sexual. I think it's sexual with a purpose. I think it's because she is a sexual being, she's a sexual woman, and she's not ashamed of her sexuality, and she shouldn't have to be. And in that regard, I kind of related to it, and I enjoyed reading about it, and I saw a lot of myself in her work, and for that, I think it worked really well. The sex wasn't in there for shock value, it wasn't in there to be appealing or to, I don't know, be flirty or seductive. I don't know, like, how to put it exactly. It was in there because her sexuality is something that's important to her and that she wanted to talk about, and that she had a genuine message to share with people. And for that, I enjoyed it and I liked it and I thought it was great. So I can see why it wouldn't be for everyone, but it was definitely for me. And I liked it. I thought it was great. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all my thoughts summed up. I could probably talk for a lot longer, but I am going to leave this here. Go walk my little Kubi bear. But thank you for watching today. Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Yeah, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you guys a hell of a lot. I'll see you again very soon.